1968, a Swiss graphic designer by the name of Armin Hoffmann created the advanced class for graphic design at the Basel School of Arts and Crafts. But Hoffmann's 2 to 4 year course is very unique in the way it evaluates its students. Specifically, it doesn't. There are no grades, tests, or exams, and completion of the class doesn't even merit its graduates a degree. Now, traditionally, this type of teaching would be considered, in the nicest terms, as a bit unorthodox. In fact, these techniques for evaluation, or lack thereof, goes against many of the considerations that the traditional Western education model is founded on. Yet, the students who complete Hoffmann's advanced class are incredibly successful after they graduate, and as such, Hoffmann's course is still renowned to this day. But why was Hoffmann's model so successful? Well, the answer lies in his challenging the assumptions that are attached to our traditional way of viewing education. Specifically, Hoffmann clearly viewed that grades did not demonstrate a student's knowledge. This illustrates that Hoffmann recognized that the Western model is simply one way of looking at education, one that he deemed to not benefit his style of learning. In Western society, many college students don't really know why they're there. They just view that it is the normal thing to do. And this is exactly the assumption that we will challenge on today's episode. Specifically, we will discuss how the current educational system in America positions students as individual entities that need to be filled with knowledge, and also examine how this take on knowledge is ultimately destructive for the current climate of education. Moreover, drawing from my atypical academic history, we will weigh the benefits of looking at education in an alternative way. This is Modality. Now, when we discuss education, I am reminded of a short story by Henrik Boll that is particularly revealing regarding one of the key assumptions for Western education. The story is as follows. One day, a fisherman was lying on a beautiful beach, with his fishing pole propped up in the sand and his solitary line cast out into the sparkling blue surf. He was enjoying the warmth of the afternoon sun and the prospect of catching a fish. About that time, a businessman came walking down the beach, trying to relieve some of the stress of his workday. He noticed the fisherman sitting on the beach and decided to find out why this fisherman was fishing instead of working harder to make a living for himself and his family. "You aren't going to catch many fish that way," said the businessman. "You should be working rather than lying on the beach." The fisherman looked up at the businessman, smiled, and replied, "And what will my reward be?" "Well, you can get bigger nets and catch more fish." "And then what will my reward be?" asked the fisherman, still smiling. The businessman replied, "You will make more money, and you'll be able to buy a boat, which will then result in larger catches of fish." "And then what will my reward be?" asked the fisherman again. The businessman was beginning to get a little irritated with the fisherman's questions. "You can buy a bigger boat and hire some people to work for you." "And then what will my reward be?" repeated the fisherman. The businessman was getting angry. "Don't you understand? You can build up a fleet of fishing boats, sail all over the world, and let all your employees catch fish for you." Once again, the fisherman asked, "And then, what will my reward be?" The businessman was red with rage and shouted at the fisherman, "Don't you understand that you can become so rich that you will never have to work for your living again? You can spend all the rest of your days sitting on this beach, looking at the sunset. You won't have a care in the world." The fisherman, still smiling, looked up and said, "And what do you think I'm doing right now?" This story illustrates that success, in itself, is a meaning that is contextual and dependent on perspective. Indeed, it challenges the cultural idea that success for one equals success for another. Interestingly, this idea appears to be the undercurrent of our system of education. Today, Western culture determines that college is the overwhelmingly right path for all who want to succeed in life. So, Naturally, kids are directed to view it as a positive experience that will reward them. But is it really that positive? Well, evidently not. Today, the college experience is fraught with stress, anxieties, and sometimes even boredom. I myself have experience with just studying for the test and almost immediately forgetting the information that was covered. Indeed, according to the National Center for Educational Statistics, in 2018, 62% of students had completed a bachelor's degree at the same institution where they started in 2012, meaning that 62% of all students who started a bachelor's degree at a 4-year college actually completed it in 6. But why is this the case? The answer? The education system as we know it bases its practices on an individualistic worldview. At its most basic level, an individualistic view of the world, known as individualism, determines that each person has, in some manner or shape, an essence to their existence. That is, as principal lecturer in psychology Vivian Burr explains, those who adhere to an individualistic approach to existence believe that there is pre-given content to a person. For instance, take the example of the personality. According to this philosophy, we all have predetermined constant personality traits that we internally draw from in our actions. Someone who is outgoing is seen as being born to be the life of the party. In the same vein, the shy kid in the corner was born to be resistant to social activity. Now, to note, here I do not deny that this view is necessarily wrong. Indeed, our society would probably collapse if we forgo this assumption entirely, for our culture is dependent on the perception that we are all individual entities. However, what I am proposing is that it isn't the only way to view the self. As social psychologist Kenneth Gergen explains, we must also consider the dark side. As we will see, what comes with the individualist train of thought is not all beneficial. To illustrate, let us consider the example of business. Now, generally, when I am thinking of business, I recall the so-called madmen of the 1950s, a term coined at the time to describe the advertising employees of Madison Avenue. A core motivation of this world, and thereby individualism itself, was an inherent motivation for self-interest. Indeed, to this day, in the business world, each person is in competition with everyone else. As such, there is a clear distinction between the self and others. However, fundamentally, this way of thinking is divisive and leads to unavoidable problems if taken as nothing but fact. Particularly, one prevailing problem of the individualist ideology that pops up in many different areas of consideration is that it posits that we are, in a sense, always alone. Gergen explains this more fully in his book, Intro to Social Constructionism, stating that by positioning everyone else to be other, we view that decisions are only rational if they are instrumental to achieving self-gratification of some kind. In this way, there is truly no selfless act. Now, I think it's best to give a personal example to the individualistic view of self in order to understand it a little bit more clearly. I myself am an identical twin. If I am speaking honestly, to the outside world, me and my twin brother Ben are seen as the same person. And to admit, it is to an extent true. I can recall when we were younger, it wouldn't really matter if you call my name or his, because in the end, we would both come running. In this and many other ways, the two of us were inseparable. And even more recently, once I began my college career and first began talking about my experiences to a new group of people without him present, I would catch myself saying, "We did this," instead of "I did this." Yet, like all stereotypes, the one about me and my brother were mostly made up. Fortunately, my brother and I are not the exact same person, because no matter what, we both experience widely different contexts and relationships. Therefore, although this may seem like a counterexample of the dangers of individualism, it actually proves them true. And this is especially true as it relates to rivalry. For, because we were brought up in a culture that prized itself on individualism, my and my twins' relationship was one that was primed for competition. especially as it relates to academic achievement, since there was always someone to compare myself with. In a sense, he was my gauge for success. I thought, as long as I'm doing better than him, I'm okay. In this way, we can clearly see how viewing oneself as the center of the universe can be destructive for one's relationships. Now, in translating the ideas of individualism into the realm of education, I think it's best to remain on the experiences of me and my twin. To note, as I just said, my being a twin heightened my sense of individual self. In fact, two of my main motivations in life while I was young were 1. To prove that I was not my twin, and 2. To prove that I was better than him. But there was another contributing factor that I've yet to discuss. That is, all of my pre-college academic experience was that of homeschooling. For me, this meant that I had one and only one classmate. Can you guess who it was? If being a twin raised my consideration of self up a step, him being the only one I could compare myself to pushed my sense of self up to another level entirely. Now, both my experience, as well as the traditional Western view of education, place evaluation in high regard. Indeed, if viewed from an individualist perspective, grades and the like are the only way to evaluate an individual's relative success in accumulating knowledge. More generally, if everyone views that they are separate entities with internalized essences, this accumulation of knowledge becomes the pursuit of all education. Nevertheless, there is an assumption underscoring this model of education that ultimately limits its capabilities and produces the problems that have been described. That is, individualism necessitates that knowledge is deemed to be a thing that can be accumulated by an individual. Moreover, in our culture, certain sets of knowledge are thought to be of a higher quality. As such, the patterns of evaluation follow accordingly. Yet, there is another way to view knowledge. Key to understanding knowledge as relational and based on our interactions with others is understanding the overarching theory that determines it as such. That is, social constructionism. At its core, social constructionism determines that nothing is inherently and objectively true. To clarify, this does not mean that it denies, say, the existence of a reality, but it does say that there is no truthful way to describe it. In this way, how we do describe reality is based on what we have learned from others. Things such as art, emotions, and even tastes are all culturally learned practices that are inherently oppressive. Since by saying that value should be placed on one practice, by disassociation, this automatically results in placing lesser value on another. In this way, good actions are relative to the society in which they are being practiced. Similarly, objective truth exists in this realm of relativism as well. For even the language that we use is not able to act as a key to describe true reality. To explain this, let's take the example of music. When we think of music, we consider the many ways in which it can be categorized. As such, we place meaning on certain characteristics. For example, classical music versus rock. But on a more basic level, even the letters that we attribute to individual keys, although not arbitrary, are ultimately relative. In the traditional view of music, notes are understood in conjunction with letters. Moreover, there are sharps and flats that describe the tones in between these. Yet, in other parts of the world, music is divided into even more tonal pitches. This means that our way of decoding music is simply one descriptive language among many. In thinking in this way, consider this thought. All meaning, which is created by our interactions with others, is formed based on its usefulness to society. In the end, this is the social constructionist stance, one wherein we recognize the plurality of meaning. But another key concept that social constructionism maintains is that meaning is continually being created. This means that even contextual truths are not permanent. A simple example is if we return to the time of the madmen of the 1950s. In this world, the common practices that make up America's way of life was that men work and women stay at home. However, social constructionism explains that this is only true in this context and historical time. Indeed, today, women and men are seen as being on equal footings as it relates to professional careers. Moreover, even if we look at other parts of the world, the normal way of life appears even more disparate. Take the case of the Trobriand Islanders of Papua New Guinea. This is a matriarchal society. Additionally, economically, their system of monetary worth is banana leaves. This clearly demonstrates that we live in a world of multiple ways of life, various different ways of describing the things around us, and a number of realities in which people exist based on context, time, and relationships. These are founded on the understanding that a tradition of meaning that passes down with each generation informs the values, standards, practices, and overall experience of the world. Unlike individualism, a social constructionist approach focuses on the patterns of communication and how they might be changed as a means for people to live harmoniously in a complex world. For the individualist ideology, meaning is internally created, and language acts as a messenger system to guide this meaning to the external world. On the other hand, social constructionism determines that all meaning is already external from our minds. In this way, the language that we use has no value until another person recognizes it as being valuable. In our society, this is normal, as we have a whole history of values attached to the English language. But even still, this language differs depending on the specific context of the situation that is being used in. For example, if I were in a non-English speaking country, English would have no meaning, since the people around me would not recognize its value. Similarly, many people define things in vastly different ways. Where one person sees an act in an action movie as incredibly violent, another who has different experiences with violence might say that its level of violence is mild. With this relational approach, social constructionists deny the existence that one definition is better. That is, the person in the scenario above simply interprets violence in a different way based on their experiences. If considered this way, a whole new world of perspectives arise, and the question moves from who is right to what interpretation, perspective, or form of life is most useful to us in the current circumstances. To bring the discussion back to the topic of education, as I have said before, key in our recognition of alternative ways of being is to understand that, according to a relational approach, knowledge is not a thing. Instead, it comes about through the process of our interactions and a mutual determinant of what is considered good knowledge. Indeed, as Gergen explains, learning is an integral part of taking action in matters about which one cares. He continues, providing an example, saying that a teacher might share his or her knowledge base, not so much to direct students, but as to offer resources, enabling them to reach goals in which they are personally invested. In this circumstance, knowledge can be understood not as a product, but a process of meaning-making and considerations of usefulness in context. And Gergen's example provides a great point in challenging the traditional understanding of knowledge, and in fact, the entire Western educational system. If we consider that knowledge comes about through relations, it seems as though our traditional view of it is rather outdated, and it is. As British author Sir Ken Robinson explains, the current educational system has come about as a product of the intellectual culture of the Enlightenment and the economic circumstances of the Industrial Revolution. Moreover, as we discussed already, meaning is a continual process that shifts within contextual circumstances. Yet, Robinson's determination is that the educational system's meaning for schooling has remained stagnant. As such, it is clear that it is not positioned to be of the highest use in the modern landscape of education. So, the question now becomes, what are some alternatives? Well, the answer seems to lie in social constructionism itself. That is, by understanding there is no objective truth in meaning, we can academically operate more freely according to an understanding of plurality. That is, if, like Gergen suggests, we focus more on the communal interactions between student and teacher, we can create an environment wherein best contextual knowledge is a co-constructed goal. Taking the example that Gergen provided, I think back to my time homeschooling. In many ways, my homeschooling was similar to how the West positions education as a process of superior knowledge gathering. Indeed, even my experiences at home was governed by the understanding that I was required to know certain things each year. For me, this took the form of an end-of-the-year test that evaluated my success in gathering the amount of knowledge appropriate for my age. Yet, I've also had an alternate experience wherein my learning was governed by a more relational method of knowledge generation. Let's set the stage. I was 17, and my twin brother and I had one more year of schooling before we moved on to college, and we had already finished the requirement for math. So we had a decision to make. Either go a whole year without having to do math, which I'll admit was very tempting, or learn calculus during the year. We chose the latter. Now, our dad was the one that taught us math up till this point. Yet, like a lot of people, he didn't really have experience with calculus. So, we had to teach ourselves. Now, traditionally, this course of action seems a bit crazy. Most people wouldn't even dare attempt to learn something that they didn't need to. Yet, thinking in this way is incredibly individualistic. If we consider that, traditionally, knowledge is seen as a set of things that bring the student into an objectively better state of mind, as well as if we recognize that calculus is seen as not part of that common tradition of knowledge dissemination, we can see how, in most cases, this type of mathematics is not normal. Yet, if we relate my experience back to a social constructionist perspective, there are multiple claims to what is considered knowledge. And this goes back to understanding that knowledge comes about as a result of the relationships we have. Because of this, we can view what students should know should come about through a continual dialogue regarding what both the student and the teacher regard as beneficial. Interestingly, Ben and I didn't have a teacher for calculus. As a result, we could actually operate more freely than if we had a teacher determining what the best kind of knowledge or way of understanding the material was for the more dominant discourse of the topic. Instead, we could consider what process of knowledge making he and I would conduct together. In such a way, everything that we learned that year came about as a result of our collaboration and our determination that calculus was a language that would be beneficial for us to understand. And in many ways, this experience was generative, as it moved my and Ben's relationship from one of competition to one of collaborative understanding, wherein he helped me recognize alternative ways of being. Ultimately, this is the answer to the Western educational system. If we think back to the likes of Hoffman, the graphic designer who was previously discussed regarding his unorthodox teaching methods, his case very clearly resembles my experiences with Ben. We had no grades. Instead, our method of evaluation was based more on Gergen's idea of formative evaluation. That is, we never considered our getting the wrong answer as being the end result of what we knew. Instead, it acted as a mark for how well we were understanding the material so far. Now, in this case, I'm not advocating that the position of teacher is something that should be completely overhauled. Instead, I believe what is necessary is for teachers in traditional education to remove the power that is associated with their position. If we consciously refuse to consider that there is an objectively better set of information for students to learn, we can consider the purpose of education is the generation of knowledge, not the gathering of it. where its value is constructed based on if the student-teacher relationship considers it useful. For example, in the case of Hoffman and his graphic design class, since there were no grades, evaluation became a process that was ultimately relational to both the student and the teacher. As such, the knowledge that was generated in the course was co-constructed according to both parties' determination of it being useful. Now, this alternate approach to education may seem radical, yet in many ways, it's rather practical. I will illustrate this point with an example. For the first 3 years of my college career, my experience with courses have fallen in line with how we've described the individualistic approach toward education. Then, I took a couple of courses focused on the realm of film production. In one course, there was only one assignment, to make a short documentary with the help of 2 other students. True, there was a final grade that was based on our performance, but the professor did not really place a lot of weight on it. Instead, the focus each week was to discuss the process of creating a documentary, and both the students and the teacher would discuss the best methods of achieving their co-created goal. In this way, there wasn't so much a strict form of grading. Rather, it appears that the professor's consideration of performance was similar to the idea of formative evaluation, wherein students are weighed according to how far they are in reaching their goals. This allowed for adjustments to be made and gave the students more agency in terms of what knowledge was being generated. At times, we would dedicate an entire class to a question that may not have even been defined as necessary knowledge for the course. In this way, the teacher acted more like a coach, guiding the students to their desired achievements for the class and providing resources for the students to reach their goals. Ultimately, the benefits of this type of education are twofold. First, because the students are actually learning what they want to, there is more engagement in the material. Second, because the professor acts more as a coach, overall, there is more interest and freedom with regard to the projects that are being made. As a result, students are not just reciting information to prove that they know it. Instead, they are furthering the generation of knowledge, which lends itself to more creativity of expression. Now, the practices that I experienced in my production courses worked extremely well. However, how would this apply to courses where there isn't such a focus on increasing a trade skill? Well, this actually has been done, and to a high level of achievement. Located on an isolated cattle ranch in California, Deep Springs College is one that is founded on the self-governance of students in more abstract fields of study. In the school, teachers ask questions like, "How do you like the readings?" or "How do you like these assignments?" all in the name to give agency to the students in relation to determining their own curriculum. Because of this, the knowledge that is generated is co-constructed through the teacher and the student much more than in the traditional education system. Additionally, this system of education fosters a high degree of peer-to-peer communication, wherein students are invited to collaborate with their fellow students, which a traditional education system would frown upon. Overall, my experience in the documentary filmmaking class, as well as what is occurring at Deep Springs College, illustrates that there is merit to shifting to a more relational understanding of knowledge. Through my experience learning calculus, as well as my time in the documentary class, not only was I able to approach the information that was being considered in a unique way that benefited me, but I was able to garner a beneficial environment wherein I was able to appreciate various ways of being or perspectives of seeing the world. If considered this way, all of education becomes a method of experiencing different languages that hold a version of reality, and also a way to generate new meaning. In the context of community, seeing education in this way leads to more appreciation of differing realities, and garners inclusivity in terms of information, wherein there is no right way to define something. It is just one way to look at it. As a result, a more relational take on knowledge ultimately allows us as a society to live more harmoniously together in a multicultural world wherein all perspectives are viewed as having a basis or reason. In this way, we are all able to challenge the dominant discourse of countless topics, approach them with a critical eye, and consider what alternative practices may be beneficial to us all. Traditionally, education is seen as something that ends. Yet, for constructionists, knowledge is an ever-occurring phenomenon based on the relationships that we maintain. So, for me, this means that even after college, I will continue to analyze the so-called normalcies of my own life and recognize that learning never actually stops. Additionally, this gives me hope. For with this perspective, I am an active agent of the knowledge-making of the world. It is not something that I can accumulate, but something that I am actively producing with others. In thinking in this relational way, I recognize a multiplicity of meanings, where value of something is contextual. As such, it invites us as a global community to be more inviting of differing opinions. For that is the only way alternative meanings can be generated. Because of this, in the future I will place a great deal more importance on the relationships that I have, because these friendships present me with opportunities to learn about different ways of being. If everyone were to adopt this way of approaching knowledge, we would live in a more respectful and collaborative world. That's all for now, and thanks for listening to Modality.